The most detrimental day to day consequence of having the illness that I have is probably best described as chronic fatigue. There used to be days at a time where I struggled to get out of bed, but even now, there are multi-hour periods here and there that impact me to the point where I'm unable to get even the simplest tasks done. There's one day of the week where this essentially no longer happens, though. Monday. Last week on the first episode of the Not That Cold podcast, I started with an Andrew Huberman quote. Today, I'm starting quoting myself. This is a quote from a blog post that I wrote in July of 2021, and I was halfway through a year in which I did a 36-hour or so fast every single week. So I would eat dinner Sunday night, and then I would eat my next meal Tuesday morning. And it's kind of weird to read this back now because even at the time, I would have a lot of these, as I just said, multi-hour periods where I was just too tired to do anything. But as I'm saying this now, I don't really experience that much anymore. I think I've had less than 5 of these flare-ups in the last 2 years. So the frequency of this has gone down a lot, and not much has changed in that time other than just my overall lifestyle. So as I'm recording this, I am at hour 70 with no food. And yeah, 36 initially was extremely difficult. I never thought that that would only be the halfway point for how long I would go without eating. And this kind of runs counter to everything that I used to think about diet and nutrition. But just to backtrack a little bit. So I was pretty lucky to have a sense of nutrition and wellness and exercise and have an interest in these topics before I was faced with needing them. I just happened to like this stuff for a few years at least, maybe not my whole life, but I was interested in biohacking, I guess, is the common phrase that people tend to use for this category of things. That ended up being very important when I actually needed all of the tools that I had. When I actually needed a lot of the tools that I ended up learning just, as a hobby. So initially what had happened was I wasn't feeling well, and I had known about intermittent fasting, but I went to go see a Chinese doctor who essentially said that a lot of the symptoms I was having at the time could be mitigated by just not eating so late at night, that I'd be able to sleep better if I just changed my eating window a little bit. And some of that was restricting the food intake by hours, but she was more concerned that I was eating close to bedtime and I was having stomach issues and just overall issues because I was having food in my stomach while I was sleeping. I was very sensitive to a lot of things at the time. So when I started to realize that that was working, that among other things, I became interested in if I could increase the effect by doing the fast for longer and longer amounts of time. I think that there were podcasts that I had listened to and maybe even a couple of TV shows. I think there's this show called Kingdom where it's a bunch of MMA fighters, and a lot of what's happening in the show is they're fasting for weight cuts for fights. And I don't know, they kind of glorify that process. I think there was a whole host of factors that played into me just wanting to try to do a bit longer fasts, some scientific related and some just not at all. But I eventually worked up to a 24-hour fast and realized it was not that much harder than this 12 or the 16 or the 18. And to give a little bit of at least what my interpretation of the science for that is, I think that when you eat a diet that is high in processed foods, high in carbs, and especially if it's high in processed carbs, you are hungry far more often. When you switch to a diet that is where basically if your baseline level of hunger is lower, it's less stark of a transition to go to a day where you eat nothing, because you're generally not as hungry. So I used to eat a lot of junk food. In the months after I started fasting just intermittently, I had also cleaned up my diet. So I was eating a lot of steak, and I was eating something approximating a keto diet, not quite, but the carbs I was eating were mostly fruits and vegetables. There was really no added sugar at that point in anything I was eating. So getting ravenously hungry, that really it stopped happening. Some people might say like you're just not someone who gets hungry like that, or you have more self-control than most people. There's no way this is true, because I have my own personal life experience of the 30 years prior to this change where I used to feel this way all the time. I used to always want to eat something. I probably eat more food just calorie wise than almost anyone I know, including people who weigh a lot more than I do. I have a fast metabolism and I tend to eat a lot. Um, but despite that, I did not have much of a problem shifting to these fasting windows, because I think in large part I had changed my diet in such a way where it just wasn't that big of a deal to not have food, because I just am not that hungry all the time. So at some point I made the jump from 24 hours to 36, and it's notable because now you're going a full night of sleep after having not eaten. So Sunday night dinner to Monday night dinner, I think there are many people who would hear this and say, yeah, I do this, by accident all the time. Like I'll forget to eat for a day and then I'll just eat again. But the jump is to then go to bed again, having consumed quite literally 0 calories from wake to sleep, and then go to bed and not eat until the next morning. So I would say I started doing this and stuck to it mostly because it made me feel better. The quote that I read at the start of this, it really did, I think, solve my fatigue issues. Um, what would happen is that on Mondays, I would skip dinner and I would be really hungry during dinner time. And then I would get wired very quickly, like an hour or two after when I was supposed to eat. Maybe it's my body realizing, okay, food's not coming. You turn on the fight or flight response. I'm not sure the mechanism. These are just guesses. But I would have trouble going to bed because I guess the adrenaline and maybe other factors was just keeping me awake. Like I was too hungry to sleep, basically. And maybe that's not the best way to mitigate being tired all the time, being too hungry to sleep, therefore you can't sleep. But it was very informative for me that at least it was informative that the mechanism existed. Like I didn't think that could happen. I think just about everyone who's never done this would assume that being hungry makes you tired. Food is fuel, and so on and so on. And that is generally true, but you hit a threshold where you've been hungry long enough, you're deprived of food, your body has run out of glucose stores, or at least depleted them substantially. And then the switch to whether it's ketones or a combination of ketones and hormones, you now are past the point where hunger is a thing, and you are deriving energy from the body's other mechanisms that aren't the normal hunger sensing mechanisms. So at some point, I started pushing the boundaries a little bit more. So 2021, I did these fasts for almost the entirety of the year. I think I might have done 48 out of 52 Mondays where I didn't eat any food at all. And it was helping me. And I also noticed that even after the fasts, I would feel better than I had before. So I think there was a long-term benefit occurring. Hard to say what it is, but and this is my anecdotal experience. I'll just caveat that, and I'll probably feel the need to continue to caveat that because I've listened to a lot of people who are experts on this topic. I'm not a trained formal expert, but this is my experience with it. So I eventually moved up to 48 hours and then 60 hours. And then I saw a show with Chris Hemsworth fasting for 4 days. And I was convinced enough by it. Dr. Peter Attia, who's one of my, I think I mentioned him last episode, um, very well regarded author, doctor, podcaster, many other things. He's in the show with Chris Hemsworth, and he walks him through the benefits and the process of doing a 4-day fast, like a full 96 hours. And I ended up trying one of these in late 2022, and it was challenging, but it actually wasn't too much more difficult than the 1 or 2 day fasts. And I think what happens is once the hunger turns off, you're battling psychology at that point. Like your body doesn't really need food, and everyone's different. The skinnier you are, the sooner you're going to need to eat. The fatter you are, the more body fat you have, the longer you can potentially sustain a fast. As I mentioned, the diet preceding the fast is also a relevant variable. But the bottom line is people can go a lot longer without food. And I don't mean just living, like, I don't mean not dying. I mean actually thriving and not suffering that much. They can go a lot longer. People can go a lot longer in that state than most people would think. So the 4-day fast was difficult for sure, but it was more of a mental game. And I'll get to that. The mental component I find potentially to be the most interesting element of all of this. Just the cognitive increase while you're on it, but also the perspective. So I do think that there's something there for everyone. You know, it doesn't even need to be fasting. Like they're relevant takeaways that apply to almost anything. So I had kind of gotten away from doing the long fasting, just kind of forgot about it for a while. It isn't the most fun thing, but more recently, I would say about a year ago, I started doing it again. And the one that I'm in the middle of now is the fourth 3+ day fast that I've done in the last 10 months. And in these last 10 months, what I've changed, it's really one thing. I have, and people who are listening will probably know this, I've started posting on Instagram primarily, but posting content of the fast. And it's admittedly kind of silly. Like I know that the visual and just the context and all of it of me just not eating and sharing that with people is strange and amusing and many other things. There's clearly an ego element to it too. Like I like getting messages from people or hearing from people that like I'm insane and, you know, why would you do this? And no one else could do this but you. And there's a lot of validation behind that. Like I am doing something that virtually no one else I know can or will ever do. And the can is because of their own mental blocks. I physically just about everybody is capable of this, but mentally, I think they don't want to in a way where they really can't. So basically no one I know will do this process. So all of that is cool. It makes me feel a certain way about myself to be seen as someone who is willing to endure more than other people and do it proactively and intentionally and not just, you know, be at the whim of what life throws at you, to actually seek this stuff out and try to create change in myself, but also just for the pure amusement of it. I think I've always liked the idea of being different in a way that people are envious of. But the actual best reason to share all of this stuff, the actual best reason to share what I'm doing publicly is that I want to stick to what I'm doing, and I'm using social media as a way to externally motivate myself. And I think that this is a subtle thing that can be completely life-changing if people were willing to adopt this concept. So we've all had the experience of knowing that you need to do something, but giving yourself rationalizations and taking the easy way out because no one's really going to know. Like whether it's conscious or subconscious, at least in retrospect, everyone can relate to this experience where there's something I know I should be doing, but it's just me who knows what's going on. And if I cheat it a little bit, there's no accountability. So who cares? And the rationalizations that go on there, I think, are substantial. I think that we can give ourselves all sorts of reasons to not do something that we know it's a self-defined goal, but we just tell ourselves, oh, well, I don't feel this, or this circumstance, or this happened, or maybe I'll do this later or another time, and blah, blah, blah. And it becomes easy to not do a thing you said you would do. If you start telling people that you are going to do something, sure, they may not actually care if you break your promise, because this has nothing to do with them. Me fasting doesn't actually change anyone else's life. It's just about me. But there is a psychological phenomenon there where if I tell people that I'm going to not eat for 4 days, and then I don't do it, there's at least, even if it's irrational, there's a fear internally that I'll be judged for that. And that might sound pathological in some sense, but it's actually quite useful. And I think more recently, in the last couple of years, I've learned to lean into that. So if I know that there's a natural bias to care what other people think, sure, there's part of me that should suppress that and reject it, because it's just better not to. It's better not to let other people's opinions of you affect your self-worth and self-esteem and all of that. But at the same time, there's a utility in it, because you can then leverage that and make the decisions you want to make. So this is a long-winded way of saying that posting the fast periodically on Instagram and receiving feedback, or at least knowing that there's the potential to receive feedback, it actually makes me stick to doing the thing I said I would do. I had a thought on day one, even of this one, even though I've done this many times now. I was 18 or 20 hours in, and it was like, well, I just recorded this video saying that I'm however far into the fast, but I could just not post it and save it for next week, because I'm not sure I really want to do it this week. Like, I'm kind of hungry. I had a long weekend, not a lot of sleep. I was out too much. Like, I'm not feeling that great. I could just, delay the fast until next week and just do it another time. No one will know. And then I thought, and this is the new level that I think has helped so much, is I should post it because of all these reasons. I should now use the fact that I'm having internal doubts, as a signal that, no, I need to externally motivate myself. Like, I'm kind of teetering here. If I put the thing out there, I suddenly have a little bit extra motivation, because I know people are watching, even if it's some small number of people. I know people are watching now, and I will stick to what I said I would do. And this is not a binary, but it's just directionally, you're more likely to do something if you create motivation in this way. At least this is what I've found. So I put the post out, decided not to eat, a little bit uncomfortable. I wanted food for sure, and then went to bed. And because I had started down this road, day one's always the hardest. And I cleared the hurdle using this mechanism that I created, essentially. There's a larger extrapolation that I've taken from this. I think this fasting is where I discovered this concept, essentially, but I'm now using it with the podcast as a whole, because a lot of what I'm talking about on the podcast, and I mentioned this in the first episode, is I want to talk about doing hard things. And if I talk about doing hard things, then I will feel obligated to do more of them. So in some ways, this is a show that I've put together to help other people. And I want to share the things that I do that are useful. I want to provide entertainment. I want to grow this so that I have more opportunities selfishly, and, future potential careers and all of that. But what's also part of it is, if I do a podcast and I talk about this stuff, then I have to do the stuff that I say. And I think doing the podcast will make me want to be healthier, so that I don't look hypocritical. And this is another way where I'm leveraging basically the the small desire. And I will say, I think I'm better than most people at not caring about other people's opinions. I'm pretty close to 100%, but that little chunk that's still left where I seek validation, as we all sometimes do, I think I'm taking that and I'm using it as a tool. And the more things I talk about doing, the more I start to build this, I guess, pseudo credibility, but it is credibility that's relevant in some sense, where I'm creating a character for myself that I'm aspiring to live up to. So, episode 1, talking about doing heat and cold, episode 2, talking about fasting. Future episodes are all going to be something like this, whether it's just me or with guests, where there's a thing that is difficult, whether it's me or the other person, kind of doesn't matter. But the overall theme is things that are difficult that I personally know I need to do more of. Either I'm really bad at them and need to get started, or I'm good at them but need to be better. And every episode I put out, I think, is this external motivation of, you said you would do this, make sure you stick to it. One of the big ones for me is it's so easy to rationalize drinking alcohol. Everyone does it pretty much. Many people do it in excess. And I am at a place where I'm probably, I don't actually think people need to drink zero, but I'm certainly at a place where I drink more than a person who cares about their health should. This is a hard one for me to stop because I'm doing a lot of social things right now, and alcohol is a part of almost all of them. I was reluctant to even say this part. Like I thought about the topics for this episode and it was like, maybe I'll just leave the alcohol thing out because that's the one that's still for me. Like, this is the unhealthy behavior that I'm kind of clinging to right now. But I kind of as I've started this episode, I'm like, maybe this is the one I need to say. And maybe others will come to mind, but I'm sure for other people, this one resonates very strongly. Hopefully this serves as some kind of useful insight where you can realize that if you just start talking about the thing you're doing too much, you will be incentivized by people around you to lessen that behavior. And this I think the person who summarized this best, it's the book's called Atomic Habits by James Clear. I think I have a quote from here. He says, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. If you don't have a system in place for changing a behavior, the odds that you stick to it are just not that high. So yeah, I'm something like 70 hours in, just to come back to the matter at hand. I'm something like 70 hours in, and I've decided to, one, make this a little fun for myself, and two, share it so that I make sure I stick to it. But I talked about how I went from 18 hours to 24 to 36 and how it didn't seem to get much harder. And I think my diet preceding the fast has a lot to do with it. I think there are people who would be curious, though, just as far as how, like, what I'm doing while I'm fasting to make this easier to manage. So basically, the way to stay in the fast is to have 0 calories. Like, essentially, if we're talking about the full scope of health benefits, you can't really consume any calories or you're breaking the fast. And to give a little bit of scientific context, there are multiple benefits to fasting. So if you're just primarily concerned with fat loss, something like a keto diet or fat fasting, which is another concept I've heard, you can do that and still get most of the benefits of what the fast does in that category. So if you had a week where you ate nothing except 500 calories of fat, let's say, and I've considered doing this. I think if I needed to lose weight quickly, this is how I would do it. You would just eat milk and butter and and meat and things that are low in protein, actually, but high in fat, to be a little bit satiating. And then you would get the ketone bump and you get the fat burning without the full starvation and the hunger that might come for people who are not as acclimated to this. So one way to get into a longer fast where you have actually nothing besides 0-calorie things would be to gradually build up time. I think the other way would be to do a longer one where you just have fat and still have like some food, but just the ones that don't mess with the ketone producing process. So you basically are going ketogenic diet with low calories. And I think that's an interesting idea. I think there's many articles about this. I don't know the validity of all of them, but I think it's an interesting concept. But the other benefit, in addition to the weight loss, which is really not the one I care about at all. I mean, I've lost something like 8 pounds in the last 2 days now, but this is not why I'm doing it. And I'll probably put on most of the weight back once I start eating again. The other benefit is something called autophagy, which is, and if you watch Limitless on Disney Plus, the Chris Hemsworth show with Peter Attia, they talk about this a lot. It's the process of the body clearing out damaged cells. I've listened to a lot of people who are the world's experts talk about this concept. Autophagy is really only well understood in mice, and we don't know the connection between fasting and autophagy in humans specifically. So it's more theoretical. And because of that, it's hard to say how many days, how many hours, what is the benefit. Like the specifics are kind of vague and murky. I think we can be pretty confident that fasting doesn't make just about anyone worse. There are certain medical conditions that, and this is why I gradually got into it because I didn't know. But that process, if potentially true, something that boosts the immune system, reduces probability of getting most kinds of cancer, other illnesses, Alzheimer's, it's long term, you're reducing disease risk by not eating for extended periods of time. That's essentially what autophagy is doing because it's clearing out the damaged cells in the body that cause all sorts of harm, inflammation, and then as a consequence of that, most illnesses that we would care about. In order to keep this mechanism alive, you need to ingest no food. And I think the limit, it's something like 20 calories a day. It's extremely low. It's essentially nothing. So what I've been doing, I've watched a lot of things on what is useful and helpful in terms of the overall goal is to keep hunger as low as possible while not having calories. So if there's a supplement of some kind that doesn't interrupt autophagy but keeps hunger at bay, that's what I'm looking for. And the main thing that, and I've heard this from people who have tried fasting, that makes it really hard is not having electrolytes and specifically salt. So if all you did is every time you got hungry, and this works day to day to a large degree for anyone who's overly hungry, if you are hungry and you drink salt water, as unusual as that sounds, a lot of the time the hunger will dissipate, at least temporarily. But when you're not eating food, you're not ingesting any salt. So additionally, you kind of just need the salt for your body. The headaches and fatigue, sometimes headaches and fatigue can come from just a lack of sodium. So my fasting protocol is I will drink as much water as comfortable, like not as much water as possible, but as much water as I'm comfortable with, and then add in salt, add in lemon juice because the calories there are very low and it's just more electrolytes, apple cider vinegar, same thing, and then black coffee, tea, all of that, chamomile tea to help go to sleep with the issues I mentioned before of being too alert at night, which is something I may struggle with momentarily because it's getting late and I have to try to go to sleep, and we're 70 plus hours into the fast. So it's basically this is the recipe for the drink that I make every so often during fasts: water, apple cider vinegar, lemon juice, salt. So the thing I mentioned before on day one where I felt the need to post something to make sure that I got over the initial hump of potentially skipping the fast and saying I can do this another time when I was 18 or 20 hours in. That has also been informative in another way. So a lot of why Eastern cultures fast is for spiritual and psychological reasons. And that component of it was completely uninteresting to me at the time. because I was starting to learn about fasting as a way to solve my own health problems. So I didn't really think about psychology as relevant at all. Not that I didn't care about that, but just I had larger needs at the time. But as I've been doing this, it's been really interesting to raise internal awareness in this way. So essentially, what I've started to notice is that there's a war being played in my mind, and this is potentially relatable, but I think to a lot of people, this is not super relatable. When you need something so badly, but you're depriving yourself of it on purpose, your mind starts looping on, maybe it's okay, maybe I should do this, do I need to, I said I would, no, I said no, it's okay. And you go back, there's an internal battle of, should I make this choice or this choice? And I have seen nothing in my own life, at least, that has brought this type of internal battling to the surface as much as when I'm extremely hungry. So I feel like a lot of people, and the reason I say that this is not going to be relatable to everybody, I think that many people, when they start to have internal conflict, they'll find some kind of excuse or rationalization and not necessarily even make a decision, but start thinking about something else or just block it out. And I think I think we all know that can be problematic long term, to just suppress and suppress and suppress and just bury issues below the surface. And then they always tend to come up later. So at least my philosophy is it's better to deal with things right away. But I think many people have spent so many years suppressing internal conflict that they've lost contact with the mechanism, and they've kind of forgotten that this process even exists at all. When you are hungry enough, it's impossible not to notice this. At least for me, maybe I'm special. I don't think so. It's impossible not to notice this. You're essentially, while at least in the parts of the fast where you're hungry, you're just constantly in your brain. Should I eat? Should I just abandon this? I'm starving. I want food. Maybe this is not necessary. I could do this another time. And it's just on and on and on and on. The voice is just getting louder and louder and louder and louder. And to some people, this might sound like torture, but I think it's a form of meditation. And I think this is probably why there's a spiritual component that certain cultures care about. I think this is probably what they're referring to. It's not just the fact that you're depriving your biological needs and that is an inherent good. I think this is why it's good, because you're learning how to cope with your own impulses, and you're not just physical impulses, but you're learning how to cope with your own impulsive thoughts and your own intrusive thoughts. And I actually do feel like this maps to other things in life. I think this actually scales and extrapolates to other problems. This is not just an isolated thing where if you learn how to deal with the hunger conversation in your brain, that's by itself, and that doesn't, change other good and bad decision making behavior. I think it actually does. I think, at least for me, becoming aware of this has made me become more aware of my own inner voice in every context where I feel resistance to doing something. It didn't it didn't get me to start this podcast as early as I would have liked to. I've been talking about doing this since December, and I didn't actually start until September. So that was a 10-month lag time roughly. But I think on average, it's made me more aware of my inner voice, and it cuts the distance between when I say, at least to myself, that I want to do something and then actually changing that thing. For the longest time, there was so much stuff that I knew I should be doing that I didn't do. And I think one of the projects of my life at this moment is to start closing the loops and filling the gaps on it's not necessarily this endless self-improvement project. It's the stuff that I already know I need to change, and just honing in on those things and shortening the duration that I spend ruminating about them mindlessly and bringing them up to the surface to the point where I have to actually face it. So during these 70 hours, I keep over and over being faced with the idea that I could just have food and this and this insanity, and everyone will forget. Like, people will know now because I have created the external boundary, but people will forget. No one really cares. And I know that is true, but because I understand what's going on in my brain now, it's easy to say, yeah, I hear you, but we're good here. Like, I'm fine. And I think it's the combination of that and the external motivation that I've created. There's a system in place now where, against everyone's will, at least the people who follow me on social media and the people who see me in person, against everyone's will, I have made everyone accountable for me. It is sort of this global system, and the more followers I get, the more listeners I get, the stronger this system will be. So I think, among other reasons, I'm hopeful to have a larger audience at some time soon. But the combination of that and the awareness of the inner voice going on here, I'm finding it much easier to stick to things that I said I would do. And I think that is a major impediment to the well-being of a lot of people, is they just, and I think it's an increasing problem because attention span is getting demolished by social media addiction and many, many other things. Just the skill of sticking to doing what you said you would do would change the lives of so many people. So maybe fasting is a way to do it. I feel like this almost sounds like an infomercial where I'm selling a product, which is don't eat. And honestly, I am a little bit, because I think it's that useful. But above that, this is just one way to get it. I think there are other disciplinary practices. I talked about going in cold plunges last week. That's one potential example. But I think this is at least the best way that I've found for managing my psychology and kind of building something that I can take forward when it's over. So maybe I'll come up with something better, but so far this is it. And it's unfortunate that this is the hardest thing. I think of all the things that I've done in my life, this one I feel like is the one that is off-putting to the most people. I think this is the one where I most often get the reaction of, I could never do what you do. Even my own doctor said to me that he didn't understand how I could pull this off. And it's honestly, it's not nearly as hard as people think it is. I think if you set up the right parameters, it becomes extremely doable. So I'll end this the same way that I think I will end every podcast. This is going to be the title of this episode. I'm not that hungry. And even if I were, I would still say it because I'm reaffirming this to myself. But honestly, at almost 3 days of no food, I'm not that hungry. And part of this is psychological, but part of it's physiological. And I think this endeavor has improved both of those quite dramatically. When will I break the fast? I am planning to make a video tomorrow morning. I have a 7:30 tea time, which will be at hour 80 of the fast. And I'm currently at a streak of 19 golf rounds in a row, shooting 79 or better. I'm going for 20 in a row, and I'm going to do it in the hardest context possible, where I have not eaten in as many hours as the score that I'm trying to get to. Maybe I'll eat right after that. Maybe I'll keep going. Usually my rule is 3 days, and then I'll base it on how I feel. But the more I do this, the more I realize how I feel maybe it's not actually that important. So unless I start to feel actually sick, I think maybe we can get to the full 4 days, which would be dinner for Thursday, Sunday dinner to Thursday dinner. That is the goal. Might fall short, but the fact that I'm saying this out loud makes it a bit more likely. So hopefully I stick to my word, and see you next time.